Founders of Thinkers50, the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking, and sharing the leading management ideas of our age, ideas that can make a real difference in the world.
In this weekly series of 45-minute webinars, we want to really showcase some of those ideas to bring you the most exciting new voices of management thinking.
As always, please let us know where you are joining from today and send over your questions at any time during the session.
Our guest today is Dr. Robert Livingston. Robert is a lecturer in public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's a social psychologist and leading expert on the science underlying bias and racism in organizations. Prior to joining the Kennedy School in 2015, he held positions at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, and the University of Sussex, where he was founder and faculty director of the Center for Leadership Ethics and Diversity.
Robert is the author of the Harvard Business Review article, How to Promote Racial Equity in the Workplace, which was the winner of the 2020 Warren Bennis Prize, awarded to the best article on leadership published in HBR each year.
And his groundbreaking approach to combating racism is detailed in the book, The Conversation, How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations, which was published in 2021.
Robert, welcome this afternoon. The title of your book is The Conversation. Can you tell us why you believe in the power of conversation? What opened your eyes to the power of conversation?
Well, I guess, first of all, thanks for having me, Des and Stuart. Life experience sort of opened my eyes to the power of conversation, because I think early on, I was naive enough to think that people would only respond to data. So I would go into these workshops and be very proud of myself in presenting all these data to back up my point. And often people would just look at me. So I remember a specific incident when I worked with a police department dealing with lots of bias. And I gave them data from the four corners of the universe, pretty much unambiguously showing them that there was bias in their department. And they sort of yawned. And it wasn't until the one Black officer on the force broke down in tears after seeing my data, which really spoke to him. But he broke down in tears, and all the white officers are sort of in a huff. They're like, well, what's the problem? And he started to tell stories. He started to have a conversation with them about the problems that he faced in the community. That one of the citizens actually called the police on him while he was walking the beat in a uniform, right? A Black officer had the police called on him. And he told about lots of other incidents. And then the officers turned to me and said, oh, Dr. Livingston, this racism thing is real. We've got to do something about it. And I thought to myself, are you kidding me? But then I thought, hey, I'm a social psychologist. I should know this. We are not computers. People don't just respond to data. People respond to people. There have been whole books written about this. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. There's a lot of research on, the irrationality of our thinking and so forth and so on. So rather than fight that, I decided to embrace it. And I decided to leverage social relationships as a portal for facts to enter and for learning to occur, because most of our learning as human beings occurs in the context of close social relationships. And that was one of the reasons that I decided to call the book The Conversation, because until we start talking about this, nothing's going to change.
I mean, and practically, what can people and organizations do to really kind of maximize conversations? Because obviously these conversations haven't taken place, or not sufficiently for the social interaction. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously that's what drives change is people actually interacting and seeing and being able to stand in the shoes of other people as well and understand what their issues are. But what can we do to have more of these conversations in organizations?
Well, Des, I think there's a few things, both contextually and culturally and procedurally. There are many things that organizations can do. I think one thing is to provide enough psychological safety for people to feel comfortable enough to have candid, open, honest conversations without the fear of really severe sanctions. And so I think if there's not psychological safety present, and that's a cultural sort of issue, that I think leaders send signals about what is acceptable, what isn't, what is encouraged, what is discouraged. I think there has to be a climate within the organizations that allows open and honest dialogue to occur among employees. But then moving past that, there's the question of how to have a conversation. And I think there's a good way and a bad way to do it. So, for example, in the book, I talk about a lot of techniques and empirically based strategies for having productive conversations and informed conversations. So, the first thing I think is actually doing a little bit of research before you have the conversation so that you know something about the topic. You don't have to be an expert, but just knowing, having some baseline of knowledge does a couple of things. It helps people have more informed conversations, but it also gives them more confidence, because I think people are less willing to speak about things if they don't really understand. I think it's also important to focus on the task and not the person. I think when you enter into a conversation, you really want to solve a problem. You're not there to insult or put down another person. So I always tell people, and there's research that shows that task-based conflict is actually good. It's productive. When people disagree about the best way to actually solve a problem, it brings lots of different perspectives to the table. But person-based conflict is bad. If you say, you don't know how to do this because you're an idiot, then all of a sudden everything shuts down and people go into defense mode. So I think it's important to really focus on the task, the challenge at hand. Why is it that you're having this conversation? Why do you want to move the needle? And then finally, I think the most important thing is to try to approach conversations in inquiry mode and not advocacy mode. So often people approach a conversation as if it were a contest and their ultimate goal is to win. So my goal is to conquer you. And that's more of an adversarial situation that you might see in a courtroom between a prosecutor and a defender. They're not really interested in the truth, right? They're interested in defending their client. That is the classic adversarial situation. But the juror or the judge is interested in the truth. And so they may ask questions. And so I think we have to assume the perspective of a juror and sort of approach a situation with a certain degree of curiosity rather than conviction that our opinion is law, and what we're ultimately trying to do is convince you to see things my way rather than listen to you and learn from you, and also have you listen to me and see where that leads us. And so I think there has to be a focus on truth. I think we won't get into politics, but in our world now, I think the focus on truth has sort of gone out the window. And I think unless there is some desire to arrive at this place that represents this inquiry, this investigation of truth, then a conversation is just an exercise in arrogance, really.
Yeah, I should quote my mum. My mum was a great conversationalist, and she always said, if you're waiting for a bus and somebody's standing next to you, you should always talk to them because they might be lonely. And I think there's a lot of talk, as you say, about listening, encouraging leaders to listen, but that kind of, as you say, kind of overlooks the ability to ignite a conversation. So that's what's missing. But obviously, you've got to do.
Yeah, and this desire for human connection, because again, I think that comes back to the root of, how you're going to actually move someone is through forming a relationship, and people are much less likely to listen to someone that they feel is not listening to them. And so I think there's a whole social aspect to it, as well as the communicative aspect, that you're also showing a person respect and dignity, and that your mom was very wise in saying, you are acknowledging a whole human being. In addition to maybe learning something from them, you're forming a connection with another person, and that's important.
I think that word curiosity too. I mean, we're fortunate to get to talk to some of the great sort of management and business thinkers. And the thing that marks out the really good ones, no matter how long they've been doing it, is their curiosity about other people, that interest, that intellectual curiosity as well. And that's what I don't understand. When you've got people in front of you, you've got an opportunity to learn about their world and to understand a bit more. But people aren't curious. They don't want to complicate their lives, and it's so sad in a certain sort of way. I mean, you use the word curiosity. I mean, how can we bring a bit more curiosity into our organizations like that?
Well, you know, there's an expression, curiosity killed the cat, right? And I think one thing that can really stifle curiosity is fear. I think if there's a lack of courage, if people don't have the confidence and they don't have the courage to really explore, and you can see this in developmental psychology with children, right? That they say the best type of parenting is parenting where your kids know you'll be there if they need you, but you kind of let them explore and go away from you and then come back to this place of security. And I think when people don't have security, and there's lots of theories in my field that talk about this, whether it's terror management theory or all kinds of theories, that when people are afraid, they want certainty. And I think a lot of dictators around the world capitalize on this, because if you create fear in a population, then people don't want curiosity. They don't want to explore. They want to know what's black, what's white, what's safe, what's not safe, what's good, what's bad. And you end up with this very rigid world because it leads to greater predictability. Because part of the exploration phase is you don't know what you're going to find. And part of the whole concept of curiosity involves, you know, a certain tolerance for ambiguity and these kinds of things. But I think, you know, when there's fear present, a lot of that goes out the window. And so I think you can put people in curiosity mode by increasing their sense of security, quite frankly. Psychological security, not security from danger, that too, but their sense of identity security, who they are, that if they make a mistake, it's not going to mean that they're not a good person. All of those kinds of things, I think, really help people become more open to exploration.
Kim MacDonald makes a point saying radical curiosity. Curiosity is a skill like other skills. Quite a nice phrase, radical curiosity. And there's a question from somebody watching on LinkedIn. Is there hope that the principles laid out in the conversation can translate to social media, or is it best for face-to-face conversations? I'm thinking about how we can best bridge what divides us, and social media tends to be a significant driver of division. I suppose you've entitled the book "The Conversation" at a point where conversations are somewhat unfashionable on social media, Robert.
Right. And it's funny because before we came on live, Des and Stuart, you know, we were talking about Madrid, right? And because I'm in Spain, for everyone watching right now, I'm in Spain at the moment. And one of the reasons I like coming to Spain is that people still tend to socialize the old-fashioned way. You meet in a cafe, you sit down, you talk face to face, you literally break bread over food, you have a glass of wine, and there's this really, I feel so connected to humanity when I'm actually around, and it's not just you, it's a public square. And you see many generations, you see elderly people walking around, you see children playing in the square, and there's all of this interaction, real face-to-face interaction. And I think there's no substitute for that. I think the other problem with social media is that the algorithms are created to put people into echo chambers. And so you're really not experiencing the whole diversity of not only humanity, but even ideology, perspectives, opinions, because you are being funneled into this matrix, this fantasy world of people who think just like you. So I think it's not only lowering the quality of communication, meaning the face-to-face, it's also creating this false sense of consensus where people sort of lose touch with reality and what communication is all about, because they're not really in situations where they have extensive communications with people who have differing opinions. And so I think there's a lot of harm. I could do a whole session on the harm that I think social media can engender when it comes to creating divisions among people. And so, no, I absolutely think that the conversation needs to happen person to person, with voice, if possible, face to face, with body language, with touch. There's a lot of elements to human communication that I think are missing once you get online in these, dispersed chat rooms.
No, I think the phrase divide and rule could have been written. I mean, it's a very old phrase, but it could have been written for social media because, that's what we, I think, if you step back from it, that's exactly what goes on. Certain politicians, at least, certainly do that. You talk about the concept of fairness. You talk about the difference between equity and equality. Now, some people would use those words interchangeably. Can you explain to us, and just so we've got it, so we understand it, so the people listening understand the difference between those two words?
Sure. So I'll give you some casual definitions, and then I'll give you some examples that I think really highlight the difference. So equality is treating everyone the same. Equity is treating people differently, but in a way that makes sense. So if you and 3 friends go out to dinner, you order different things from the menu, the bill comes, it's $200. If you split the bill equally, all 4 people will pay $50. And some people will say that's fair. And in fact, I've gone out to dinner and people split the bills that way. But if you split the bill equitably, the person who ordered the steak and lobster may pay $90, and the person who orders the chicken Caesar salad may pay $25. So that's different amounts, but it makes sense because they ordered different things and there's a different cost. I sometimes hear parents say, I treat all my kids the same. And I think that's actually not true. If you have a child that's 14 and a child that's 4, treat the 4-year-old the same as the 14-year-old because they have different needs. Even if you have 4-year-old twins, one might be more confident and outgoing, and one might be more shy and diffident. And you would actually tailor your parenting style to the unique needs of the child. That is equity. So how does that sort of come into play when we talk about people in organizations? I remember when I was 8 years old and I went to the track meet of one of my cousins, and I remember feeling outraged because I looked down at the track from the bleachers and it looked like all the other runners had a head start over my cousin because he was on the inside lane. And I remember protesting to my parents, my aunt and uncle, my other cousins, like they need to stop the race, bring them all back and give them an equal starting line. They need to line each runner up shoulder to shoulder and let them run that way because right now they've given a head start. But I didn't understand the concept of equity, and I certainly didn't understand the geometry of circles. And they tried in vain to explain to me that there was a different distance on the inside lane and the outside lane. And if they had given them an equal starting line, which is what I wanted, that it would have given an unfair advantage to my cousin on the inside lane. I think a lot of people see the world like I saw that racetrack when I was 8 years old. They say, why not just treat everybody the same? And they don't realize that there's a track and it was designed to be a circular track on purpose, that we are not running a straightaway, because if it were a straightaway, you could line everyone up shoulder to shoulder and have them run and there would be no advantage. But in fact, there are certain groups that are relegated to the inside lane and certain groups to the outside lane. And so I think we have to sort of stagger the starting lines, which involves treating people differently, but in a way that makes sense. Even though people might say, hey, that's unfair, or why can't we just do it based on merit? That is merit, because according to the geometry of the track, that is how you create a fair race. Now, I didn't understand that as an 8-year-old, and some people don't understand it as a 38-year-old when we talk about the world. But I think that is what's key to doing this work well, is really getting people to understand the difference between equity and equality, and how that translates into fair treatment.
Yeah, I think these are really important distinctions. You also make a distinction between individual privilege and institutional privilege. Can you talk about that, Robert, how that works and your perspective on it?
Yeah, and it sort of echoes one of the questions that you asked me before about conversation and the power of conversation. I start off the book talking about a conversation with the fellas. And this was a group of blue collar workers in the facilities division of a large organization. They were plumbers, welders, pipe fitters. And they called me in because the fellas had chewed up and spit out 2 other diversity consultants. And they had warned me that this was quite a hostile crowd. And I said, well, why on earth would I do this? No, thanks. And they called me back and shamed me into it because they said, well, Dr. Livingston, we thought you would be someone who would rise to a challenge and be comfortable preaching to more than just the choir, but maybe we were wrong. And I said, you know what? Those are fighting words. I'll be there, but I need you to do something for me. Before I dive into these conversations around race, I want to just talk to these people and get to know them and form a relationship. I'm from Kentucky originally, so I'm familiar with bluegrass culture. I grew up fishing, I grew up hunting, and we had a lot of points of connection. And I found magically that once we talked, and it wasn't for very long, 2 hours, we had food, that they were very open to hearing what I had to say. And that, to me, highlighted the importance of conversation and what that could lead to. So, I'm talking to the fellas and we're sort of forming this rapport and it leads them to sort of be more open to hearing what I have to say and me to what they had to say. So one of the things that they said is, Doc, we don't understand this whole concept of white privilege, because I'm looking at you and you've got more privilege than I've got, despite the fact that you're Black and I'm white. I live in a trailer park. I struggle to pay my bills. You don't struggle to pay your bills. You have a nice home or several homes. Tell me where this privilege is. And I thought about it, and that led me to sort of conceptualize this distinction between individual privilege and institutional privilege. What they were really pointing out was the fact that I personally had individual privilege. So individual privilege is what you have personally, your financial situation. Institutional privilege is the privilege that society gives you. So, I would talk to them about whether they feared that their children might be shot and killed by the police. And they were like, no, right? And after we've, in the wake of January 6th, I guess they're not even afraid to get shot by the police, even when they're attacking the police, right? That's a certain amount of privilege, right? It's a different kind of privilege that I have when I pay my bills every month, but it's a different kind of privilege that's kind of baked into the caste system, to use Isabel Wilkerson's term in the title of her book, that we basically have this caste system in the US based on race. And that's always been the case, that no matter, how smart you were, how much money you had, race was always the first cut. So it determined whether you were free or whether you were enslaved. It determined whom you could marry. It determined where you could live. It determined all these things. And we still have vestiges of this caste system that gets embedded in institutional privilege. And it's a 2x2 matrix. You can be high on both. This might be Bill Gates or Elon Musk. You're both. You have individual privilege and institutional privilege. You could be low on both, which is a person of color who's indigent, right? Who doesn't have resources and is also of color. Or you could be in one of these diagonal positions, which I thought was interesting, which is you could be a wealthy Black person, or you could be a poor white person. And what I helped them understand, and we talked about the movie Green Book, because there's a movie that really focuses on those diagonals. You have a poor working class white guy who's serving as the driver of a rich Black musician. And one of the plot lines of the movie is who has more privilege. And we see that it's the white guy, that even though he doesn't have any money, he's granted access to places that the Black person, despite the fact that he does have money, is not granted access to. So I think it's important for people to sort of understand that difference between individual privilege and institutional privilege and how they interact to impact people's lives in one way or the other.
I mean, it's a great film. I'd recommend it to anyone. It's a good watch. But I mean, I've heard you talk about it before, and I think it's true that in the UK, certainly, our first cut isn't necessarily based on race. We still got this lingering class structure. I mean, how does that play out? Because presumably that would give us a different 2x2 matrix.
No, I think it gives you the same 2x2, but just perhaps with different weights on those 2x2s. Whereas in the United States, institutional sort of trumps all. And I think in Britain, it may be the sort of resources. And I know the whole class system in Britain is much more complex than just money, right? Because it's centuries old. It's not just the resources you have. But what's interesting about it is that race also matters in England, right? It's not just class. And I think there is a certain amount of institutional privilege that people have for being white, but it's very different than in the US, because if you go to the council estates, for people in the US, those are housing projects, public housing. The council estates in Britain have a diversity of people. There are lots of white people who live in the council estates. In fact, in a lot of cities, it's predominantly white. And so you don't even get this division that you get in the United States, whereas the predominantly, except for Boston and a couple of other exceptions, it's mostly people of color. And so it's interesting that you do get people of different races who are in the same class. And there's an interesting book that I saw when I was last in London. It's called Chav's Desk, which as you know, is a sort of a term in England that I think roughly translated to American English would be thugs. But chavs could be people of any race. Whereas in the US, we sort of associate that term thug to people of a certain race. Chavs, in fact, probably are mostly white when people think of chavs. So yes, I think there are differences, but there are also similarities. And I think race also comes into play in England, but perhaps not the same way as in the US, because your histories are quite different. Race, we have the caste system that we have in the US for a reason, and it's always been embedded in our history, in our laws, in our social mores, in a way that it hasn't been as strongly embedded in the British history and laws and culture.
Yeah, what about the quality of conversations then, Robert, in different countries? I mean, you speak French, you speak Spanish and French and Portuguese, and you're in Madrid at the moment. What do you notice in the different nature of the conversations as you travel?
Yeah, well, I noticed a couple of things. It's a great question, and it's one that comes up a lot, is how do you deal with this issue of racism internationally? And as I discuss in my book, there are many, in fact, some research shows, white people in the United States who don't think that racism is a real thing. They think it used to exist 2 centuries ago, but it doesn't exist anymore, and especially not since Obama, right? People thought we were downright post-racial. But if you go overseas, that multiplies times 100. In fact, I hear again and again that racism is a uniquely US thing. And often people in England, and I'm not saying this is what you said, but they try to say that racism doesn't exist in the UK, that it's class. Or you go to China and they say racism doesn't exist. Or you go to France, or you go to, you fill in the blank of the country. And I think it's really important for people to understand 2 things. One is that even though the players change, the game stays the same. And Isabel Wilkerson talked about this in her book, Caste, because she really drew parallels between the Indian caste system, the system of racial hierarchy in the US, and the system of Nazi government in the 1940s Germany situation, and sort of said they all kind of overlap. And what she's essentially saying is there are systems of oppression everywhere in the world. There are haves and have-nots everywhere in the world. In some cases, it may be based on skin color. In some cases, it may be based on ethnicity, such in Rwanda, where you have the Hutus and the Tutsis. They're both Black. Or it may be based on religion, which you had in the 1980s and 90s in Northern Ireland, Catholic versus Protestant. It could be based on, any number of things. But you basically have this situation where you relegate certain groups of people by birth, nothing that they've done, just by the social category that they belong to, you've relegated them to a second-class status or position. So that's everywhere. So if any country tells me, hey, we don't have racism, I say you do have your form of ism, whatever that happens to be. That's the first point. The second point is that they actually have racism. So even when I'm here in Spain, even though I'm American and that's maybe the first category, they don't treat Black Americans and white Americans the same. If you go to China, they don't treat Black Americans and white Americans the same. So if you control for class, you control for nationality, you still see a racism effect. And this is the product of colonialism. All around the world, people have internalized the notion that lighter people are superior to darker people, or that Black people, and even in India, lighter skin, right? In South America, you have pigmentocracies, where most of the wealthy people are of European origin, and the people who are indigent are of indigenous origins or African origins. So all around the world, you have some manifestation of racism in its purest form, meaning that people who are lighter or more European occupy a higher socioeconomic position than people who are darker or more indigenous. And that's everywhere. I have not been to a single country, and I've been to about 60 countries. I have not been to a single country where Black and white people are treated exactly the same, or that Black people are preferred to white people in certain ways. So I think it's a universal.
We've got a question here from somebody watching on LinkedIn. And they say there are various shutdown moments in trying to have conversations about race, from that's critical race theory, to I'm a nice person, I have a black friend, so I can't be racist. What advice do you have for overcoming these barriers to good quality conversations about race?
Yeah. So there's a woman who wrote a whole book about this. Her name is Robin DiAngelo, and the title of the book is White Fragility. And the central thesis in the book is that progressive white people with egalitarian values, are prevented from growing in the situation because they're so fragile that they don't want to put themselves in uncomfortable situations, or they don't want to expose the possibility that they could harbor racist sentiments, right? And that in doing that, you actually shut down the conversation, you actually stifle your growth. And one thing that I help people understand is that, you know, learning by definition, right? And at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, we talk about the learning zone, which is nestled between the comfort zone and the danger zone. So if you're so comfortable that everything is familiar, then you haven't learned anything. It's like a child who's learning arithmetic and then they go to algebra and they're like, oh my gosh, I feel frustrated, I feel stressed. That's part of the process because you're learning something new. Now, you don't want to push people so far that they enter the danger zone, because then it becomes traumatic and they shut down. But you want them to be in this sweet spot between the comfort zone and the danger zone, which means getting out of the comfort zone. You have to do that if you want to grow. And it's not just for learning, it's for anything, even bodybuilders. Your muscles have to ache sometimes. If your muscles never ache, it means your workout is not strenuous enough and they won't grow. And so I think there has to be this willingness from people to make themselves vulnerable. And it gets back to that point that I made before with the courage and people not willing to be curious, not willing to step outside the comfort zone if they feel fearful. But I think that's part of learning. I think that's part of growth. I think that's part of progress, is that people have to be willing to do that.
People put a lot of emphasis on meritocracy and hiring the best candidate. And you have a good thing. You're from Kentucky, so it probably comes from the Kentucky Derby, the racehorse analogy. Can you tell us tell our listeners about that, Robert?
Yeah, so it started because when I would go into companies, they would give me two reasons why they were hesitant to adopt diversity policies and initiatives. The first is they didn't know if it would be fair, and they essentially equated pro-diversity to being anti-white. This is kind of the equity versus equality thing that I was just talking about. And then the second was they said, we just hire the best candidates, and they thought that you have a choice between hiring the best candidate and hiring the diverse candidate, right? And so what I had to do is then challenge their whole notion of what it means to be a best candidate. So I love the Kentucky Derby example, especially this year, guys, because people show up at the Kentucky Derby and they think they know who the best horse is. And in fact, they're so sure they're willing to put money on it. It's called gambling. And the tracks make lots of money for a reason. It's because most people are wrong. And these are horses with a CV, a track record, a mile long. These horses didn't just fall from the sky once they get to the Kentucky Derby. You can find out everything you want to know about these horses. And yet, and still, most people make a mistake. And this year's winner was an 80-1 odds against winning, right? So my point is, the only way that you can know who the best candidate is, because the best candidate is an outcome. It's not a trait. And so if we're at the Kentucky Derby, there's only one way you can know. The only way you can know who the best candidate is to fire the pistols, let the horses run, and you see who wins the race, who crosses the finish line first. Anything prior to that is speculation, it's gambling, it's favorites rather than actual winners. There's a lot of terms you could use, but best candidate is not one of them, because you don't know who the best candidate is until they cross the finish line. So similarly, in organizational situations, you would have to put all 500 applicants in 500 alternate universes. So now I'm talking about a sci-fi experiment, like a horse race. Press play, see where they are 5 years from now, and then say, oh, okay, that's the best candidate because they've produced the most profit, or they've generated whatever your metrics of success are this candidate has done it. But shy of that, you don't know if you hired the best candidate or not. That's the first issue. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and I think really complicated, is there's a statistical concept that's called statistical banding. And it was first discovered by Sheldon Zedek. And what it argues is when you have a pool of, let's say, 500 candidates and you give them a test, you would think the best candidate is the one who scored first and the worst candidate is the one who scored 500. But that's not actually true. There's no difference between the candidates who score first, second, third, fourth, fifth, maybe even 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th. They form what's called a statistical band, which means they are interchangeable, which means if you gave that same test again, the candidate who scored 9th on the first round might score first on the second round. And the candidate who scored first the first round might score 10th the second round. Same thing in horse racing. Even the horse that won the Kentucky Derby doesn't mean they're the best horse, because they come back and they run 2 more races, the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes. And it's almost never the same horses who win each of those races. Occasionally you do, and you get this legendary 100-year talent like Man of War, which all the streets in Lexington are named after, which was a horse that was unbeatable. But those horses are born once every century or so. But usually the horse that wins the Kentucky Derby is not the horse that wins the Preakness or the Belmont Stakes. Why? Because these horses are so closely matched that whoever wins on any given day is up to chance. And so, you know, I'm on the admissions committee here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And when we are looking at candidates, we don't rank order them. We might have 2,000 candidates, but we come up with a high cutoff. That's a really high cutoff. And then we treat everyone above that cutoff pretty much the same. And we start to look for other things, like, you know, for undergrads, who's from Alaska? Because if we just let geography rule, we would fill the dorms with people from New York and California, because that's where most of the people are. And it's harder to get someone from Alaska or Montana because they're fewer. So if they're in that cut, we might say, we'll pull out the person from Alaska. But that doesn't mean we've lowered the quality, because sometimes someone from California might say, hey, I got a 1580 on the SAT, and you let someone in from Alaska who got a 1560, and I was more qualified because I got a 1580. That just means they don't understand math. If they took the SAT again, they might get a 1560 the second time, or even a 1520 or a 1510, because there's a certain amount of error. And just because you happened on that one round to score 20 points higher doesn't mean that you're more qualified. So I really try to teach those concepts to leaders so that they can understand how you can look for diversity, whether it's students from Alaska or Montana, or whether it's students or whether it's employees of color or women or whatever, the LGBTQ, people with disabilities. You can maintain a high quality of candidate without sacrificing quality and without sacrificing diversity.
No, that's fascinating. We've got a good question here, I think, from Megana, who says, how do we balance, compensate the emotional labor expected from folks of color when primarily white institutions, individuals want to have conversations about race? And conversely, at what point do we need to place the responsibility on white people to have the conversation with themselves, other white people, before asking for this labor from people of color? I think that emotional labor is an interesting point.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And to be honest with you, Des, and whoever asked the question, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. Because I feel like it's my job. This is what I do. But if you're an engineer working for Microsoft who just happens to have pigmentation, your job is not to have conversations with people about race. Your job is to design software or whatever the job happens to be. And so if people are really serious about it in the organization, they can avail themselves of tools so that they can, in their own, home, in the privacy of their home or whatever, get the information that they want without having to tax or put this emotional burden on people of color. So I say that's the first thing, is that people have to seek out resources on their own. The second thing is, I think there have to be structural mechanisms within the organization led by top leaders that sort of distribute the work. And so what do I mean by that? lots of organizations don't have an office or a division or even a person, a chief diversity officer, whose job it is to do this. If you set up the right business units, the right mechanisms, you're actually paying people to do this work rather than taxing people whose job it isn't to do the work, but they just happen to voluntarily do it because it's important to them and it affects their lives. So I think leaders have to take proactive steps to make sure that people of color don't fall into those traps, meaning, even though it's voluntary and it seems voluntary, they're doing it because no one else will do it. You step in and you create other people who are doing the work so that it takes the burden off of them. And then finally, I don't think it's appropriate to obligate people of color to talk about their issues. I've talked about the power of conversation and the power of stories, but I think it's up to people to decide whether they want to share those stories rather than being put on the spot or being put in some kind of spotlight where they feel obligated to share their stories, because it is emotional work and it is exhausting. So three answers: books, structures within organizations, and completely voluntary after you have the books and the structures in place.
Which organizations get this, Robert? I mean, there's a lot of, you can be negative about this, and you can think about organizations which plainly don't get it and leaders who really don't understand these issues. But which ones have you encountered that have really filled you with optimism and joy that are actually having these conversations?
Well, I wouldn't use terms as strong as, joy and elation and pride. And I would say it's a continuum, meaning, organizations that get it are like at 100, and organizations that are, the Ku Klux Klan would be a 0, right? And then there's everything in between. I have not really come across an organization that's higher than a 90. So I just want to preface it with this, that there are very few organizations that truly get it and truly. Having said that, there's a continuum from 0 to 90. And there are organizations that I think are operating at more of an 80 or a 90 than a 0 or a 10. And in the book, I talk about 3 organizations. I pick out 3 and talk about things that they've done. One is Massport, which is an organization here in Massachusetts that decided to change the basic criteria that they use to award contracts to developers. So it used to be that contracts were awarded based on whether you had the money, whether you had the infrastructure and the right team, and whether you had the right design to build a hotel, for example, on their land. And each counted 33%. But what they did was add diversity for reasons that I don't have time to go into now, but I actually wrote a case about and discussed it because all the same people were getting rich. But they added diversity and they made it 25%. So diversity was as important as whether you had the money or the infrastructure. And it forced developers to go back and look at what they were doing, because if they didn't do anything around diversity, they would get 0. And they would now at the most be at a 75 and they wouldn't get the contract. And so they started to look around and say, are there any women-owned architecture firms? Are there any people of color who own, structural engineering firms? Are there any restaurants or people of color who are entrepreneurs that we can put in the commercial space of this restaurant? They really had to be creative and think about how they could integrate diversity. And many of them said they didn't do it in the past, not because they're racist, but because they're busy. And what you want to do as a developer is get from point A to point B in the quickest amount of time possible. But what Massport forced them to do was slow down and actually do things differently. And once they did that, the developer said, I'm glad they did, because this was a great experience. The women-owned architects are even better than the guys we've been using for the last 40 years. And, the people of color structural engineers were much better than, the guys we've been using. So I think companies have to be courageous enough to actually bake diversity into their policies and practices. That's the point that I'm making with this example, is there are so many organizations that have wonderful mission statements, and they come out with, these grand pronouncements and objectives and promises about what they're going to do. But the proof is in the pudding. And I think the organizations that really change how business is done are the organizations that create policies that, change how diversity is valued within the organization. And that's just one example.
There's a great passage from your book. There's a great quote. The goal is not to boil the ocean, it's to boil the water in your pot or kettle. The bigger, the better, and put it in the ocean. I think what you were just talking about to some extent talks to that. We are running out of time. I think this is just one of those conversations that you hope would run and run. But can you say a little bit about that? Because I think that's quite a philosophical point about boiling the ocean or boiling your own kettle.
Yeah, and it's based on this fable, there's a parable of the man who's walking along the beach, and there's all these starfish, and there's millions of them, and he's overwhelmed, but he wants to save the starfish, so he starts picking them up one by one and putting them in the water. And a cynic comes along and says, what you're doing doesn't matter. There's millions of starfish. And he looks at the one in his hand and he says, it matters to this starfish, as he puts it in the water. And so I think this whole notion of the pot boiler, for me, is lots of people coming to the beach and gathering as many starfish as they can. And if everybody does that, then we can clear the beach. I think when we look at the world and all of its problems, we kind of want to treat it like a light switch to say, okay, we want it all over. What can we do to solve this once and for all? And I think it can create a certain sense of discouragement. But I think if people realize that you have a certain pot or kettle or hot tub, some people have a bigger one than others in terms of the vessel or receptacle that they can use to boil the water. But I think all you can do is control what you have the power to do. And if we all do that, then we can collectively boil the ocean by boiling our pots and dumping it in the ocean. And I think it's a way for people to feel empowered to do things. And like with the starfish example, you can actually affect the lives of people. That's the only reason I still do this work. I've had people of color, I've had leaders. I work with chief justices of state judiciaries in the United States. And they've come to me and said, you actually have changed the way that I did this or that. And if that can trickle down to someone of color who's in front of that judge, or if that can trickle down to a person of color who's given a chance, who wouldn't have been given a chance, that's my starfish. And I feel like even though the world is still on fire in many ways, that is the contribution that I hope to inspire in others to create this movement of pot boilers.
Inspiring. The stories are the things that are going to change the world. I think that's a really strong message from this conversation, Robert. Thank you very much, Robert. Brilliant talking to you. So we recommend Robert Livingston's book, The Conversation, practical, inspiring, and insightful. We would encourage everyone to go out and buy a copy. Thank you very much, Robert. We're away now we're having a rest for 4 weeks, and we will tell you all about our future plans in the next few days. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Goodbye.